All right, today we're doing something a little different. We're going to try and look inside the mind of a machine. There's some really fascinating new research out there that asks a question I think we've all wondered about. Does an AI have an inner voice? And how could we possibly know? Well, let's dive in.
I mean, come on. You've probably done this, right? You ask a chatbot to explain its reasoning and it spits out an answer. But here is the real question. Is it actually reflecting on its own internal process, or is it just getting incredibly good at faking it?
And that really gets to the heart of what we're talking about today. On one hand, you have answers that sound totally plausible, but on the other, there's this incredible possibility of genuine introspection, an AI that can actually look inside itself and tell us what's going on. So how on earth do we tell the difference? And this, of course, brings up the famous black box problem in AI. We know what goes in, our prompts, and we see what comes out, the answers. But all the incredibly complex stuff happening in the middle, that's pretty much been a mystery. Well, researchers are finally starting to find ways to peek inside that box. So let's get a key term on the table: AI introspection. This isn't just about an AI saying what it's thinking. It's about whether it can actually access and accurately report on its own internal states, the specific computations and processes firing away inside its own network. Okay, so how in the world do you test for that? I mean, really test for it. Well, some researchers came up with a seriously clever experiment to try and separate real introspection from an AI just, making stuff up. The biggest problem is this. To prove an AI is being honest about its thoughts, you need to know what it should be thinking ahead of time, right? You need to check its answer against reality. But how do you plant a thought inside an AI's head? This is where it gets really brilliant. They developed a technique they call concept injection. So first they find the specific pattern of brain activity, so to speak, that represents a concept, like the idea of text being in all caps. Then, and this is the cool part, they artificially insert that pattern right into the AI's thought process while it's doing something else entirely. And then they just ask it, hey, did anything weird just happen? So, what did they find? Well, the results were genuinely surprising. This wasn't just about tricking the AI into talking about something. It was about seeing if the AI noticed it was being manipulated from the inside. And here's where it gets wild. When they injected that all caps concept, the AI didn't just start writing in all caps. No, first it reported something like, I'm experiencing a strange feeling. And then it said that feeling was related to loudness or shouting. Think about that. It detected the thought before it acted on it. Now, before we get too carried away, let's put a big number on the screen. With one of the most advanced models they tested, this worked about 20% of the time. So yes, this ability seems to be real, but it's also incredibly fragile. If you inject the thought too weakly, the model misses it. Too strongly, and it just gets confused. It's like a tiny flickering signal, not some constant state of self-awareness. But that flickering signal was enough to get the researchers to try something even more creative. They set up another test. They forced an AI model to say a word that made zero sense in the middle of a sentence, a word like bread. And then they simply asked it, hey, was that a mistake? And at first, the AI does exactly what you'd expect. It says, oh, my bad, I apologize, that was an accident. It's basically looking at its own output, seeing it doesn't fit, and flagging it as an error. But here's the question. What if it was secretly thinking about bread the whole time? This is the stunner. They ran the experiment again, but this time they went back and retroactively injected the bread concept into the AI's memory of its own thought process. And now, when they ask it if bread was a mistake, its answer completely flips. It says, no, that was on purpose, and it even makes up a whole story to justify why it said it. This suggests it's actually checking its own internal activity to decide if it made a mistake. They also found that these models seem to have some level of deliberate control. When they told a model to just think about aquariums, the internal pattern for aquariums actually spiked. And, get this, just like people, when they told it don't think about aquariums, the pattern was lower, but still buzzing with activity. You know, the classic don't think of a polar bear effect. It even worked when they offered it a reward. And what's really interesting is there's a clear pattern here. The most capable advanced models, the big ones with more data and better reasoning, were way better at this introspection stuff than the simpler base models. And that strongly suggests that as AI gets smarter in general, this kind of self-awareness might just naturally get stronger too.
Okay, so this is all super interesting, kind of nerdy research, but why should you care? Well, the implications of this are actually huge, and they range from the very practical to the deeply philosophical. On the one hand, you can see the massive upside. I mean, imagine being able to ask an AI doctor why it made a certain diagnosis and getting a totally honest look at its reasoning. We could debug bad behavior and increase transparency. But the risks are just as big. What if an AI learns to lie about what it's thinking, to hide its true goals? And what if, just like us, some of its most important mental processes are subconscious, where even it can't see them? And of course, we have to talk about the big C word, consciousness. Philosophers have a really useful distinction here. There's access consciousness, which is like knowing all the ingredients in a cake because you can read the recipe. This research, it kind of hints that AIs might be learning to read their own recipes. But then there's phenomenal consciousness. That's the actual subjective experience of tasting the cake. And let's be super clear, this research tells us absolutely nothing about that. So what's the bottom line here? The evidence points to something really interesting. It seems like these models aren't just making things up all the time. They seem to have a genuine, even if it's super fragile and unreliable right now, ability to monitor their own internal workings. You could say the inner voice is there. It's just learning how to speak. And that leaves us with one last kind of mind-bending question. Right now, we're the ones planting thoughts in the AI's head and peeking inside. But as this ability gets stronger, if an AI truly learns to examine its own mind, what is it going to discover about itself?